She is a theatre maker and an arts educator. She is also the curator of our children's program. As we start the session, please turn off your phones or put them on silent if you haven't already. Please note that flash photography will not be allowed. The event will last 1 hour, including some time for audience questions at the end. Thank you for joining us here today. Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Galle Literary Festival. I'm really proud to introduce Kiran Millwood Hargrave to you. Having read the 2 books that we're discussing today, I have to tell you, there's nothing unbiased about this. I think the writing is splendid, and I'm really looking forward to maybe getting Kiran to just tell us a little bit more about herself and her writing. So let me begin. Kiran is an award-winning novelist, poet, and playwright. She was born in Surrey in 1990. Putting aside, or perhaps only delaying slightly, her early burning ambition to be either a cat or the first woman on Mars.
I say that for the school audience.
I thought it was excellent. Anyway, we are all the luckier that she chose to write. Now, Kiran graduated from Cambridge University with a degree in education with English and drama, and then with a master's in creative writing from Oxford University. Her debut children's novel, The Girl of Ink and Stars, won the Waterstones Children's Book Prize and the British Book Awards Children's Book of the Year, and is a perennial bestseller in the UK. Her book, Julia and the Shark, won the Waterstones Gift of the Year and the Jake Fox Award for Excellent Books. Other titles, including The Island at the End of Everything, The Way Past Winter, and The Deathless Girls, have been shortlisted and longlisted for many awards. While her book, Lilia and the Blue Fox, is being featured at our children's program this year. Her latest children's publication, In the Shadow of the Wolf Queen, has been hailed as destined to be a classic, and I, for one, can't wait to read it. Kiran's poetry has appeared internationally in journals such as Magma, Room, Agenda, and the Irish Literary Review. In 2013, her poem Grace won the Yeovil Literary Prize. Now, she also writes plays. Her first play, Boat, which is about human trafficking, was staged in October 2015 by Pig Dog Theatre Company in Balham. It opened to 5-star reviews, with Culturefly magazine calling it the most compelling and urgent piece of theatre you will see this year. Today we're focusing on Kiran's writing for adults. Her debut adult fiction novel, The Mercies, won the Betty Trask Award, and also the Prix Rive Gauche à Paris. While The Dance Tree has been reviewed variously as intriguing, spellbinding, and a compassionate evocation of women that raises questions about faith and love. Welcome to Sri Lanka, Kiran.
Thank you, it's lovely to be here.
And you're here with your husband and your baby.
Yes, they are not here because my baby gets very freaked out if she hears my voice and I'm not right there. She starts screaming, so she's at the hotel in the pool. Probably.
Well, I hope you all enjoy the festival. So I'm going to chat to Kiran for a little while, and then I will open it up to you for questions. Now, both The Mercies and The Dance Tree are based on actual historical events. The Mercies is set in the 17th century on a tiny coastal island called Vardø, which is the easternmost point of what today is Norway. The Dance Tree is set in the 16th century in Strasbourg, which was then known as the Alsace region. Can you tell us a little bit about these 2 incidents and what drew you to them and what prompted you to write about them?
Of course. So, good morning everyone. Thank you for being here so bright and early. It's lovely to be here. So I'm a bit of a magpie, and I have a folder on my computer full of ideas for novels, lines that come to me, and also historical events that I find interesting. I think nothing is truth is far more strange than fiction. And when I was searching for an idea for my first novel for adults, I came across this incident of a storm that took place just off the northernmost point of Norway. And in this storm, it was Christmas Eve, and it arrived so suddenly that eyewitnesses said it was as though it was conjured from a bag. It arrived in sort of this sweeping tide, and then it left almost as quickly as it arrived. But by then it had already killed 25 men who had been out fishing on Christmas Eve. And this was actually the majority of the population, of the male population of this island called Bardo. So what you had left behind was this community of women. And then, on Wikipedia, after the storm, all that's said about this island is that it became the site of Norway's worst ever witch trials. And it was the most murderous spell in Norway's history at that point. And there was nothing in between. There was this silence for 3 years. There was the storm, and then there were the women being killed for conjuring the storm 3 years later. And nothing in between. And when you're a writer, I'm sure we have many writers in the audience, when you're a writer, it's such a gift to find a silence like that, because you want to write into it, you want to explore it. And that's really what the Mercies became. It became what that it was me filling that silence between these 2 points, between the storm and the witch trials, and how those two things came to lead one link to the other. With the dance tree, that was again just a gift that fell in my lap. I was scrolling through this incredible website called Atlas Obscura, and I highly recommend it if you are also a fan of the arcane and the strange. And it said they danced till they died. And so of course I clicked the link. And it was about the world's deadliest dance plague. You may have heard of dance plagues before, but they're basically instances of mass hysteria where people have danced essentially to exhaustion or to their deaths. And the largest ever instance of this happened in 1518 in Strasbourg in Central Europe, in the middle of the hottest summer that had ever happened. And it does intrigue me that so many unusual events, I mean they happen throughout history, but especially across this 100-year period that's sort of drawn between these two books. And when you look at the wider context of what was happening, it's just such a fascinating period of history. We were about to enter a miniature ice age in the region, in the European region. So there were events that couldn't be explained by the time's science, and people were really quite afraid of the weather events that were happening. Then you had wars, the erosion of the Ottoman Empire, the expansion of the Ottoman Empire and the erosion of the Holy Roman Empire. So you had this clash of cultures happening and this feeling of people that they were being invaded and taken over. And it really echoed with some of the sentiments that sort of in my country led to Brexit, for example, this fear of the outsider, this fear of the other, and a real closing in, a closing of ranks and trying to preserve. And it's all, yeah, people's fear basically really interests me as a writer, and particularly how it impacts the most vulnerable in those societies. So both in class and gender and race, and that sort of intersectionality. And you'll find that in both the books. It's about women, but it's also about those who have the least in society, and it's also those who are outsiders in society.
Thank you. And what you're saying is so right about the fear. When you're reading either of these two books, there were moments where my heart was literally in my mouth. And I couldn't read fast enough, like what's happening? It's so intense, and she's an absolute craftsman in terms of how you build tension or build to a climax and then come down. We'll get into that in a bit. Now, your children's fiction, with the exception of the island at the end of everything, is all rooted in fantasy. Was there something about these historical events that made you think, I'm going to do that because it will distinguish my adult fiction from my children's fiction? Was there a sort of thought of that, or was it more like, well, this is how I find stories?
I wish I was so, not calculated, but I wish I was so conscious of how my inspirations find me. it was very much an organic move. And yes, my children's fiction is fantasy, but it's also incredibly earthy. It's very rooted in myth, always as well. And so it's the stories we tell each other, and it's how people make sense of the world around them. And it felt like a natural through line to eventually one day tell stories for adults. My favourite writers are people like Margaret Atwood and Philip Pullman and Babsi Sidhwa, and people who have written for children and they've written for adults, and they've just followed the stories where they take them. And so it's very much an instinctive thing for me, which I think my agent wishes it was a bit more sort of, where are we going next? But it's very much for me the person I am at that moment in time, what's going on in the world around me, and what I find myself drawn to. It's very, organic.
All right, thank you. Now, both your stories are set in medieval Europe, when the Catholic Church was pretty much the state. There was a lot of conversion going on, to put it briefly. And, the line was definitely drawn between Christian and pagan, with Christian, of course, equaling good, and pagan, a term which really vilified indigenous customs, pagan being equated with deviltry, really, literally. And in that time, things like, this is deviltry, that was not an opinion, it was not a belief, it was fact. It was accepted as fact. And the church, in each of these instances, it is authoritarian, it is oppressive, it's the main source of fear for the protagonists. I mean, it threatens them spiritually, it threatens their physical safety, and their refuges, the places they call their refuges, which are symbols and practices of the old ways. Are you trying to tell us something? I mean, all authors are trying to tell us something, but are you really a bit of a pagan?
Maybe. I never really thought of myself as anything. I was very much raised sort of between. So my mother has Jewish and Hindu heritage. My dad was confirmed and then rejected his religion. And I was always raised to be very open-minded, very tolerant, and I think what I've always been raised with is to trust people's instinct for God, but not necessarily trust a fixed interpretation of God. So it feels important to me that people have that freedom to sort of celebrate their spirituality or not, however they see fit. And of course, as you say, I'm writing about a time when God was gravity and a fixed view of God was undeniable. There was no leeway, and it was written at this point. So Strasbourg was the home of the printing press, and the point when my book takes place, it's sort of this proliferation of the written word for the first time, which is very exciting, obviously, as a writer, very exciting, but also bad news for anyone who fits outside the limits of what is written. And we encounter many people who sit outside that in the dance tree. And 100 years later, in Norway, when the Mercies is set, little has changed. In fact, this was when, of course, the witch trials craze swept across the whole of Europe. It wasn't just in Norway, it was happening in Scotland, it was happening in Germany, it was happening in France. And in their thousands, women were being murdered for being witches, for sitting outside of society, outside of the accepted norms of religious dogma at the time. So, yes, I suppose I'm a pagan. I am declaring it, but insofar as I believe in religious freedom and in freedom of expression, and that there was no room for that. And again, it brings us back to fear. There was no room for that because society, as people knew it, was disintegrating, and people were scared, and they needed a way to hold on to how things were. And when society works only for a small group of people, they will do anything to try and keep it that way, because it's terrifying to lose what you have. It feels like failure, it feels like defeat, even if it leads to like the redistribution of justice. If you're taking from someone, they will always feel hard done by. And in the dance tree, that was the Holy Roman Empire really battling the Ottoman Turks and seeing them very much as devils, because of the colour of their skin, because of their beliefs, because of how hot the country they came from was. You know, it was a totally different culture. And then for the Mercies, there was a very close relationship between Norway and Scotland. I mean, areas of Scotland are closer to Norway than they are to Edinburgh. So it sort of carried over from the King James sort of declaration of witchcraft, carried straight over into Norway and led to this witch trial craze that culminated in the Baja witch trials, in which so many women were murdered.
Yeah, and I was reading in one of your interviews, actually, where you actually went to Vado in winter, and so these women, spoiler, they're kind of thrown into the ocean, and what you're saying is the ocean was frozen, so they actually would have had to go through the effort of breaking the ice to do this. I mean,
I still have a visceral reaction to that statement. It's one thing to write something and it's another to know it, and I think by the time you've finished a novel, you should know it, you should feel it in your blood, in your bones, and that's very much how I write. I'm a very from-the-body writer. I commit myself to my characters in that way. And so when I went to Varja, and I'm a cold water swimmer, and I did go in the sea in a wetsuit. But yeah, I had to break the ice, and it was just a quick plunge, and it was consensual. And I hadn't been sort of beaten and starved, and I wasn't, you know, it really brought home the cruelty inherent in what people were claiming to be something good, an act of God, and yeah, this is what I love about historical fiction, is however long ago it was, human beings, we're basically the same, and we share commonalities like fear, like hunger, like love. And so when you go and you bodily experience something that your character has experienced, it instantly twines you closer to the narrative, and then as a writer you hope to pass that on. So I was really glad when you were saying you were quite upset while reading the books, because that's what I wanted. I wanted you to feel upset when things were happening. I wanted you to feel invested. I want you to feel happy when they're falling in love. And you know, it really is important, that emotional connection, especially in historical fiction, for me is important to draw you close to the characters.
Yeah, and I'm just going to ask Kiran to read a couple of passages now from the dance tree. Kiran, if you don't mind, not the dance tree, the Mercies. If you don't mind reading the first one. So I've chosen a couple of short passages, and this is still relating to the theme of sort of good versus evil. And Absalom, who is sort of the main, in this story, in the Mercies, he's the representative of God on the island. And his reaction to finding, you know, what are indigenous traces in the village.
Yeah, so Absalom has been sent from Scotland to bring the women to heel, essentially. Outside their house, he stops so suddenly that she must swerve, catches her hip against his. Husband? His eyes are narrowed. There. See? Ursula does, but isn't sure what she is seeing. Over the lintel, roughly carved into the wood, are a scramble of shapes. A circle with lines waving from it. A sun, and beside it a fish as basic as a child's. They are in turn obscured by more carvings. At first she thinks someone has tried to erase them, but the crossings out are too regular, deliberate. Runes, breathes Absalom, and there is something in his voice so foreign she doesn't at once recognize it for what it is. His hands clasp his jacket convulsively. Her own fear rises to meet his. Husband? They are runes, he says, and his voice is shaking. He turns and scans the houses about them. Ursa watches as he strides to the nearest and knocks on the door. No one answers. They are probably still gossiping at the Kirka. He comes back. It is as the lensman said, worse perhaps. His gaze has taken on a feverish edge. The mud has started to swallow Ursa's slippers, but she doesn't want to go inside.
And just one more.
So this is by the time a bit further in the book where Ursa, who is Absalom's wife, is embedded slightly more in the community, but Absalom is sort of very much becoming more of an outsider and becoming more involved with matters outside of the town. They are witches. Ursa's arms come across herself. Often as not, says Absalom. He is flattered by her interest, she can tell. How is it proven? There are tests. He leans forward, and though there is an undeniable frisson of excitement in his voice, there is fear there too. Our King James in Scotland has written a book on how to spot and test a witch, but the laps are easy enough to catch. They have drums of stretched skin, and they beat them to summon demons. He crosses himself, and Ursa feels a chill slide beneath her skin. Demons. They can do that. Surely as a minister can call on God, says Absalom gravely. Old times, before King Christian ordered it, they were not even bound by law to destroy such instruments. Mo's letter says they have one they seized. They dare not burn it in case it releases something. Ursa shivers. You truly think it possible? I have seen such things are possible.
Thank you. Right. Yes, please. Right, there's one more that I'm asking her to do. So, talking a little bit about literary or historical fiction, rather. In the UK Sunday Times review of the Mercies, you've been likened to Hilary Mantel, amongst other historical fiction writers. And I also read a comment from you in a later interview where you say you don't want to be pegged into one genre. Now, though, you're becoming known as a writer of literary fiction who creates strong female characters. Yeah, right. I mean, what are your thoughts on that whole debate surrounding that label of someone creating strong female roles? I mean, do we really need that peg, or have we arrived at a place where that distinction is not needed anymore? I mean, we don't talk about someone writing strong male characters, you know. Shouldn't a strong character be recognized as a strong character irrespective of gender?
It's an interesting question, and it's not simple, as no things are. I think, you know, we have moved so far, and there is further, but we have moved so far, and so there's the recognition of this. And I think that my answer would be different if I was speaking to a child's audience. I think then I'm slightly more emphatic about the need for books to be mirrors as well as windows. I think that you need to show children in particular what is possible. But I think in adult fiction there is the chance to be more ambiguous, and I want to write I want to write soft men and hard women, and I want to write human beings in all their complexity. And it's the problem with labels like strong female characters is that strength in medieval Europe is very different to how we perceive strength now. Then strength might simply be saying no, or or choosing not to marry, or just following your own path. Whereas now that's maybe more acceptable, a lot more acceptable. And I really resist placing modern concepts of feminism on my characters, because I think it does those women a disservice. It really rankles when I read a character who's out of time in a book, because it wasn't so easy. It wasn't so easy to be your own master. If you were a man, it wasn't so easy to reject certain norms. And so I do try and respect the constructs that people were living under, and take each character as they come. Maybe you will read, hopefully you will read the books, and maybe you will find them not to be strong. Maybe you will wish they went further. But for me, it felt right, and it felt like what they would do. And it's always character first for me, and I'm very much led by that. And it's ambiguous, and that's what I like about people, is we're not simple, we're not one thing. And so I write about women, but I also write about the men who love them, the men who hate them. I write about their children. I write about people as full beings, and try not to have them stand for something.
Yeah, that is very evident. I mean, we're slightly running out of time, but I would have wanted to also talk about, what then is a strong character. Because in both these books, you can see the strength of these women, but you can also see that their weaknesses. And sometimes the strength in the stories is just, for instance, staying when you want to leave. Or, finding, like you said, the courage just to say no. The women, they're all incredibly compelling. I think you can't help but fall in love with all of them. And you're absolutely rooting for them. There are a couple of women in the Mercies where you're like, okay, maybe not them. Right? But at the same time, you don't hate them. You can't help but understand why they do what they do. And really, or mostly what you feel is pity. Yeah.
Which they would hate.
Yeah.
Which I like.
Yeah. So, fear and fetters make us do unimaginable things. And the empathy you feel for all your characters is very evident in your writing. How do they come to you? Are they fully formed? Do they arrive fully formed? Or do they grow as you write? And are any of them, for instance, Kirsten, in the Mercies, are they based on actual fiction, historical characters?
So in the Mercies, all of the women initially they had the names and the jobs and lived and were the ages of women who I'd found had been murdered in the witch trials. And then I knew that I needed to give myself permission to detach from their narratives. Firstly, because there wasn't enough known, and I didn't want to be disrespectful. These were actual human beings that lived and died. So I wanted permission to make them all my own. So then what I did was I broke their names up, which may be more disrespectful on reflection, but I broke their names up and combined them in new ways. And that gave me enough breath to do my own interpretation with them. With the Mercies, initially, there are two main characters. It's a dual narrative in the Mercies. One is Ursa, who the two passages I read from, and she arrives on the island with her, having been collected from Bergen by her husband and taken north. And she is the daughter of a once well-to-do ship owner who has fallen on hard times. And then we have Marin, who is really my primary protagonist. And she was who arrived first, and she has lived on Baguio her whole life. She lost her brother, her father, and her betrothed to the storm. And she lives now with her mother and sister-in-law and her nephew in a too small house that feels smaller by the day. And she has always felt herself to be slightly outside of the community anyway. She didn't really fit in with any of the Kirka women, the women who were very involved with the church. And then she finds becomes very close after the men have died to Kirsten, who is a fan favourite. She's sort of, people are like, why did you write about Kirsten? And I do have an answer for that, but she becomes the de facto leader of the village in the men's absence. She lost her husband, who she loved very much, but she was very much an equal insofar as it was possible to be at that time with her husband. He would take her fishing, so she knows how to fish, and she does scandalous things like wear trousers. And Marin and Kirsten, they become very close, and they become the watchers of the village. They start to track people's different moods, people's different alliances, until Marin falls in with Ursa, and then she loses her detachment and her judgment somewhat. And so Marin was my initial character for the Mercies. I had this dream, which does not happen to me. I'm not someone who gets gifted scenes. I have to work quite hard for my writing usually, but the opening scene in the Mercies is of a woman climbing down to a beached whale and comforting it as its flint for its flesh, basically. And that came to me in a dream, and I knew instinctively that woman was Marin, and it told me everything I needed to know about her, that she is alive to the world and its sufferings, but also practical enough to survive it. She knows what must be done to survive in a place like Baguio, but she is not cold. Since people have described her as like a barnacle clinging to a rock, and it looks really hard and hardy, but actually if you prise it off, there's like this softness at the centre, whereas Ursa is like a coral. She's very beautiful, but then you calcify her down and she's stone in the middle. So these two characters and their interaction became very important. But initially it was just Marin, it was just the barnacle, and it was a hard book to write. There was no breath, no light, no joy in it, and I was getting depressed writing it. So I need someone, I need colour. And actually when Ursa arrives on the island, she's wearing a yellow dress, and she became a symbol of what is possible outside the life that Marin has experienced her whole existence. And these two characters, they bloom together and they sort of bring each other out. And Ursa finds her strength and Marin finds her softness. So Marin was first, but Ursa, she needed Ursa. We all need an Ursa. I think I might be an Ursa actually. I think I'm quite soft, but maybe a bit harder than I know I am.
Thank you. Moving on to the dance tree. So there are those sort of short chapters where you present us with the women who are impacted by the mania. And you give us an idea of their lives and why they sort of go into that state. So what was that writing process like? Because, where do you start? How do you, try and give us a sense of, this is why this woman went into this physical mania. Tell us a little bit about that process.
So, I know that I've already made this point, but this is a thing that happened, and this is always extraordinary to me. This dancing plague where up to 800 people a day joined the dancing, up to 15 people a day died. And it became so bad that they built stages in the centre of the Strasbourg market. So they closed down their economy and they built stages to herd the dancers on. They brought in musicians to play the devil out of the dancers. That didn't work. More people joined the dancing because of that. And it just took over the whole of Strasbourg for one incredibly hot, hellish summer. And this idea, and it was mainly women dancing, and it was mainly poorer women dancing. And why? And I just wanted to know why. I wanted to know the particular conditions of oppression that made dancing yourself to death feel preferable to living one more day in your right mind. And so initially the narrative was very much focused on my protagonist Lisbeth, who is in her final months of pregnancy. And she lives on a beekeeping farm, and she is slightly separate from the city of Strasbourg, but she slowly gets drawn in by this mania, and particularly by the women she sees dancing, and she starts to question, why? What is causing them to exist in this trance-like state? And for her, it becomes about being part of something bigger. For her, in the same way the bees fly together, she recognises a sense of belonging that some of the women feel. But I didn't want to imprint that on all the women. I didn't want to make them a faceless mass. So throughout the book there are interjections. I think there are maybe 8 or 10 interjections where we see different women, some of whom existed, some of whom didn't. And we explore their reasons and how they came to be in Strasbourg, because it was the city of immigrants, and how they came to join the dancing. And it was just really an opportunity for me to explore the different psychologies of the time and introduce some wider context also for the reader, because the problem with writing historical fiction is there's so many interesting things that you want to put in, and you can't, because it's important to stick with the narrative and the character. So it is nice to have that wider context and understand some of the greater pressures people were under.
Which brings me to how much research went into that, because I can tell sometimes she's very clever. Sometimes it's almost like a throwaway line about, what the women on Vardio do with the fish bones, for example. And it's very casually dropped in there, but the moment you see that, you realize how much research has gone into these books. How does it happen for you? Do you do it all? Do you research everything first, or is it something that also sort of evolves alongside your writing?
It's very much the latter. It's very much, for me, if I did all my research up front, you would get a history textbook, because it is just fascinating. It could. But what I'm trying to write is a fiction, a character-led fiction, so the character has to come first. And all the details that I include in the books are things that matter to the character. So things like the fish bones for combs, and these are women and they like to look presentable, so that's something that I could throw away. But it was difficult not to get entangled in the intricacies of cod fishing in North Norway, because it was such a fascinating time, and the tidal streams were all changing, so there was a huge lack of good fishing, and it's not interesting, maybe, to you, but it became very interesting to me. So yes, I have to write my narrative first. I have to meet my protagonists, I have to know what matters to them, and then I can start stitching in the detail. And it very much, that means that sometimes first drafts are completely embarrassingly wrong. In the first draft for Mercies, they were all drinking tea and living in wooden houses. There are no trees that far north. Wood was very hard to come by. You'd have to pay extra for it to be brought up on a ship, so only the very wealthy people would have had the 2-story stabbers that we maybe associate with northern Norway. Everyone else was making do with turf and burning turf, and turf was a way of life. And no tea, and it was all small beer and dried reindeer. So you have to be willing to be wrong, and to then I go back and I stitch in the detail. And with the dance tree, it was similar. Knew nothing about beekeeping. Could now write a textbook on beekeeping in medieval times. It's fascinating, but it's just what matters to the character and what we see through them.
Your writing really uplifts and empowers the marginalized, the outcasts, the untouchables, literally. The dangers faced by the LGBTQ plus community in both books, the racism that Erin faces in The Dance Tree, the colony of lepers at the island at the end of everything. Can you share with us what your influences are, or incidents that have shaped your worldview?
I think a big, this is not a question I've had before, but I think a big answer is my mother. And so she was raised in India, and she went to school in a convent school in the hills, and in Missouri, and she used to volunteer at a leper colony, and she used to change bandages, and it was, so really I want to go now, right now, and call her and say, what was it that made you unafraid where others were afraid, and what was it that made you feel you are no better than the next person? And I think part of the answer could be that actually her father came from a low caste and was sent through the efforts of the village. It's a lovely story actually. They whitewashed their village, and then in the morning they woke up and a beautiful train had been drawn in charcoal on the new whitewashed walls, and instead of being angry, they said, who did this? They have talent, and it was my grandfather. And so he was sent, then 12, with his 16-year-old brother to the city to study art, and he became an architect. So he sort of moved from a low caste, and he became one of the upwardly mobile. And then similarly with my father, he used to have newspaper for shoes, and then grew up, his father was a miner, and then he was the first in his family to go to university. And so I think it's very much the sense that anyone is anyone, and it's all about opportunity and luck of birth. And I've always been incredibly aware of my privileges, because one generation back they didn't exist. So maybe it's something to do with my parents and where they come from, and yeah, just this sense that the luck of birth is so strong. So yeah, probably my parents made me very interested in why people are afraid and the distribution of power and all those sorts of things.
Right, now, like I was saying to you backstage, I think your secret weapon is your ability to really describe something in detail and to really immerse an audience in the landscape, in the lives of the characters. You know, in the Mercies, you feel the cold. She describes it, the bleakness, how desolate it is. You almost feel it creeping in your bones. And, you know, I can see, for instance, how calloused Marin's hands are. All these little details really make you feel like you're there. And with the dance tree as well, you know, it's vivid, it's so vivid, you can literally see this dance tree. And there's an amazing description of beekeeping. So there is a kind of magic in your realism. And I think your writing is very poetic. It's not high poetry, but it feels very poetic. And that's an intrinsic part of your voice. What advice, I mean, how did you develop that? And what advice would you give an aspiring writer in terms of finding your voice?
It's so personal. For me, I started as a poet, and that taught me a lot of lessons especially about editing, because obviously you can spend days writing a line and then it doesn't work.
I was going to say, how important is an editor in that process also?
Exactly, yeah. Well, I have a very good relationship with my editors who work on these books with me in the UK and the US, and they really push me on voice, because it does come quite instinctively to write in a certain way, and it's quite with the Mercies it's quite stark, as you say, and quite chilly, and then in the dance trio I wanted you to feel like you're under a cloche, like I wanted it to feel oppressive and like sticky, so they really push me to use language in a very economic way, because I think my tendency could be towards overly lyrical, and so I really enjoy working with them in the way that they basically are pushing me always with every book to write better and to write more myself, essentially. So it was really poetry that taught me, and I love the contemporary Scottish poets like Robin Robertson and John Burnside, and then American poets like Lucy Brock-Broido, and the way that they use language that is quite baroque, and by that I mean it feels quite strange in the mouth, but also is exactly the right word. It feels, it's ornate without being overwrought, and it's very beautiful. The way I want to tell you a story is as important to me as the story itself. So the way that I tend to find that flow is a lesson from writing for children, and that's speaking aloud. You know, the earliest stories, and always my favourite way, I still make my poor husband read to me aloud, and I love hearing stories aloud, and so it has to sound right in my mouth.